We are joined by Elizabeth Ranzas. Hello, Elizabeth. How are you?
Hello, and thanks very much for inviting me. Thank you.
We would like to ask you a few questions about educational support, because as well as working in a cross-curriculum way, running through the cross-curriculum topics and the normal subjects, the pedagogy of death has the second characteristic that it crops up whenever a death occurs. So the first question that we want to ask you is whether when a death affects a student or a group of students, the school should do something.
Well, that's a really good question because it's basically a question I've been addressing all the years I've been working as a consultant in schools. We should start from the premise that the schools are places where we educate people among people. And of course, within this education, there's obviously room for all the situations that make us human beings and that come together in our daily lives. And one of those is death. Interestingly, the reason why I devote myself to pedagogy of death is because a classmate of mine in high school died and none of the teachers intervened in any way. This has been the approach for a really long time. I think because of fear of handling the emotional situation that the student present, not knowing how to deal with the issues that arise with regard of grief and with the students. It's quite the opposite though. It's essential for high school, early childhood, and primary schools to act. Firstly, from the moment of death in whatever form occurs, and secondly, to support the students at all times. Because dealing with a bereavement or dealing with a death doesn't only happen at the moment when it takes place and we learn of the death, but it's a long process that requires a series of measures. I believe that the actions of the early childhood, primary, and secondary schools are important in these situations that take place daily in schools, and they are important not only for the students because as individuals and groups, they allow them to handle their emotions and to handle everything that can be expressed among themselves, but also as guidance for families. Families often don't know how to act either. We adults have in this society, at least, or in this culture, it's not something universal, the tendency to hide everything that we believe can harm kids. And there comes a times when we don't know how to manage these situations. If someone can advise us and tell us that it's not right, for example, to tell a child that the father or the mother has gone on a trip, but that we have to be honest in dealing with the real event, then we can obviously avoid a lot of suffering later. So that's essential, and the work is different in each of these situations in which death occurs. But we must intervene, as we must intervene together.
Elizabeth, in whatever case, who will be the most suitable professional figure to make this intervention?
In principle, that's always the authors, who usually have closer relationships with the students in particular classes, but because there's ones who usually spends more time with the students in those classes, but they shouldn't be the only ones who can act in these circumstances. Just as tutorial action is something that we can share among all the teachers, this task can also vary. Depending on how it happens, the relationship between the students and the teachers and all the staff working in all the school. Undoubtedly, the authors can play a key role in the coordinations, so they need to be aware. They need to have information and manage these things so that everyone flows through appropriate channels. But it could be a PE teacher or an English teacher who, at a given time, a student chooses you as a model, as you support figure, or whom with they can express themselves. and open up and begin to work on the whole process of grief. Because grief is a process, and everyone of us has our own time and our own ways going through it. So the respect that we should have and the coordination between all the teachers need to be something that we can take into account, and the tutors obviously need to be sensitive so that they know when they can intervene and when they should act in the classroom and when they should take a step back or maybe let other figures intervene. And I'm talking about PE teacher or an English teacher or the school counselor or any figure in the school.
What happens is that there are perhaps deaths and deaths. There are cases which support from the tutor can be enough, maybe most of them, but there are cases in which the tutor supports it's not enough.
And in fact, as we said before, not all deaths are the same. And I believe that this is one issue that concerns us the most in terms of educational diversity, because it doesn't only depend on the person, but also the type of the death, the type of assumptions we've had or our knowledge about the death. I've witnessed it many cases, and there's a huge difference between a death by suicide or violent death or a death about illness. That's been a long process and therefore has enabled the students to prepare for the moment of loss or a death in a traffic accident at the school gates. Sometimes it's not enough. Obviously, the support that we have as educators, the educators in a school can give in a natural way. And we need to know these indicators to be able to refer cases and to coordinate with specialists who can work effectively and in a more specific way on these deaths. Especially, although it's not a good to generalize, but the deaths that are suicide and someone has been there and has actually seen the event that moment, a violent death or a death that's involved a combination of griefs in a very short space of time, well, there are times when there's obviously not that easy or their grief process is not so normal. They require intervention.
So preferably, supports by tutor perhaps exceptional according to the sets of indicators, for example, which Croen or other writers mention that tell you how far you can go. And on that basis, communicate with specialists if the school has one. In addition to the idea you've put forward here, you work at the Príncipe de Felipe High School in Madrid. Could you synthesize or make another set of proposals for putting the pedagogy of death into practice through school support?
In principle, there are various indicators or characteristics that every plan should follow. These can be multiple, and I see more and more that teachers, depending on the circumstances and the students themselves, can come up and proposals that until now perhaps hadn't occurred to us, depending on the cases. But to sum up, as we have said, in all of them, the teachers should have a sensitive approach or should listen sensitively. It should be based on the principle that it shouldn't be an egocentric intervention. That is, that we shouldn't think that we know how to do absolutely everything. So we should know when to step back and refer the case, when to step back and allow other teachers to intervene. It should be action based on a total respect for all the manifestators of grief that we can see, and they'll be very diverse. From children who show their emotions in a very open way to those who don't show them and are already showing them, we have to be sensitive to the issue. But above all, it has to be coordinated action so that we all know where we are going, and there has to be a lot of communication with the families. It's terrible to be doing an activity in class and then realize that every morning a relative of a student has died and you didn't have the information. And it's something that we need to know that's important for both families and teachers to be aware of. And it's an intervention that not only takes place at the moment in which the issue has happened and therefore attends to the absolute present, but also looks to the future and to keep track of the students. It's not enough just to, when someone dies, decide to make a book in class that everyone writes and that we then give to the family. Or if we decide to hold a kind of ceremony where they take a video with the most meaningful images and we can call the family, and once we have done all these things, we bury the issue, to coin an appropriate phrase. But we should be attentive to how our students develop in that sense, because that's what support is all about, knowing what they need through the process and why there can be so many different activities. They can range from, well, making a book, keeping the. I think it's essential to keep the student space through the school year and to know that there's a person who has been with us for some time and continues to be in our memory and in our thoughts. And it helps if we have students participate. If we put forward some ideas, but they decide, if we give them ideas about how we can say goodbye to that person, but they are the ones who can effectively think how they want to say goodbye, either individually or collectively, because there too we should have respect and a sensitive approach.
Because the group exists and the student will need the support of others and so on. Could you specify, because you mentioned at the beginning, when you talk about saying that the parents gone on a trip, the kind of lies that are told sometimes with the best intentions, a particular mistake or two or three mistakes that actually are usually made instead of the technical correct procedure, is that just explained?
It's interesting because, from my point of view and my own experience, I think I've realized which are the things that we should not do more than the things that we should do, because this will always vary and a lot and will depend a lot of the circumstances. The first thing is to be honest and not to work on the basic lies, because lies are something that boys and girls at any age know how to detect. They also hurt them a lot. Obviously, it will depend a lot on how we communicate with the child or the adolescent at their particular age. But there are issues that are basic, and that is to speak clearly, to work with the word death from the beginning. That's essential. I remember, for example, the case of a girl who was 5 or 6. She was about to turn 6, and her grandmother has just died, and she had been told that she had gone to heaven. Of course, a few months later, we were walking along the beach and we saw a group of people hanging glittering. And the first thing the girl said was, "Look, here comes grandma." Because obviously, what they understand isn't the same as what we want to express metaphorically. And though death is a construct that develops over the years, if we use the right words and explain to them little by little that this person isn't coming back, that they have no feelings, they don't feel hunger, cold, pain, etc., little by little, we can effectively develop this more complex concept. But if we lie to them, saying things like, "Granddad is sleeping," we can even cause the child to be afraid to go to sleep. Or if we tell them that he's watching us from the sky, they can also be terrified that they are being watched all the time. I think that on the one hand, absolute honesty in this sense is also knowing that we don't have all the answers. It's appropriate, and when someone asks us something we don't know, that honestly can also comes in, right? When you say, "I don't know, but I like to believe," or "I like to think," or "I like to imagine that's this way," that's appropriate, but because hiding things is always more harmful than being honest. Because I think that a child can endure everything but lies.
We can conclude from the conversation we're having so far that it could be relevant. It could make some sense that in a high school, your high school, for example, there could be something like planned period of mourning, a plan of these situations that happen.
In fact, we are trying to introduce that in every aspect of the school's directives through a planned procedure that sets out a number of actions for the different educational actors and the pace and the timing that should be followed in a general way, so to speak, to deal with these events. I believe that it's necessary and it should be something that everybody knows, that from the moment we are aware of the fact, which has also changed a lot. Before the social media, the schools was usually the first to find out about this issue, but now you can go into class and realize that the students know something you don't know. So, from how we found out and how we involve the families so that this information reaches us as soon as possible, to how we act during the whole process, I think that's essential. Above all, to avoid misunderstandings, often too because the family, and we also respect this, doesn't want certain details or certain issues to be known. And therefore, it's important to talk to them and to know to what extent we can talk to the student and what we can say. And especially to know how we can act and what assumptions we should have with respect to issues such as difficult mourning. For example, after a year, we hold a ceremony, we plant a tree, that these issues are accounted for in advance and made explicit so they don't stay in the hidden curriculum, and that the teacher who's sensitive to the issue does them, but the others don't.
So, do you think that is planning of the mourning period could be or should be compatible with, for example, Islamic or Catholic or Protestant beliefs?
All religious and non religious beliefs have to be included, as we said at the beginning, talking that sensitive approach. In both cases, first, we always have to coordinate with the family and be well aware of the family's beliefs in this respect, but particularly our students' beliefs too. And we need to make sure that diversity is addressed effectively in class, and that if someone wants to say goodbye in a certain way or approach mourning in a certain way which their beliefs set out for them, there are also other people who can work effectively with those same circumstances from other perspectives. And so we need to know how to watch and listen and see the differences and to bring them all together at different times or at one time that can bring everyone together. On the occasions when I've intervened, these two perspectives are usually taken into account. So there's one time when there's a meeting or a ceremony about the students that a little more secular because it's the students who organize this meeting or this farewell, and on the other occasion it's the family that organizes a ceremony closer to their religion, and we also participate in that, those of us who want to join in alongside the family members.
Great. That's to say that procedural planning is compatible with beliefs, and I believe that how it should be, right? We've already mentioned that you are a teacher at the Príncipe Felipe High School in Madrid, but now we would like to leave your school aside, and as an expert in the research of pedagogy of death, I'd like you to ask you a last question, and then we are through. And that is, if you can make a particular suggestion, give us some idea about age difference. In fact, we're not specialists in children or anything really, but could you specify a bit in terms of age?
Yes, of course, just as we should take development psychology into account when working with the students, in this area it's essential to know what states the concept of death has reached in the child, because it's not an easy construct to handle and it includes many features that require maturity on the part of the person to understand meaning in all its fullness. Therefore, As we said at the beginning, when we were talking to small children, we should use concrete, clear words that don't have double meanings. And we need to bear in mind that often they are going to ask us questions, like if they feel something or not in their grave, or although we've said that the person is dead and isn't going to come back, if sometime they come back, because as we said, the concepts of universality and reversibility are things that are required with age. So that means it's not the same to talk to a 5-year-old child as to talk to a 10-year-old who has already acquired these concepts more and whose thinking is much more concrete than with adolescents, who also have their particularities because although they actually handle abstract thinking in a way that's similar to adults and are able to engage in very complex conversations, they are going through a period that, on the one hand, makes them shift away from adult models and tend to group themselves more among the affinities they have because of their age. And on the other hand, maybe they don't show their feelings much, and it's as if they are quite cold, or they act as if they don't care about certain issues, and so we find adolescents who may be expressing a certain coldness towards the death of a classmate, and yet internally they are feeling a lot of grief and pain, but they don't want to show it. Or they may burden themselves with situations, as in other classes I've seen, that aren't their responsibility. In the sense that if the mother or the father has died, they may be weighed down with issues they've taken on that could be dealt with among other family members. But it's complex because with adolescents, although it's possible to speak much more clearly, there are times when you have to be much more prudent and much more sensitive to know what silence is about or to know what cold answer is trying to say. And it doesn't only depend on age, it also depends on the previous experience that each one of us has. It's not the same when a boy in kindergarten or a girl in primary school has previously lost a pet and talking about mistakes. We haven't done what we do as often. The dogs died, well, buy another one. Mistake, of course. Obviously, we are not giving you the chance to say goodbye to something that has been so important in your life. So it's not the same if there have been previous experiences, like friends who have separated from you, or you have moved house, or there's been a separation in the family, or previous losses, than when there haven't. It depends on the death in particular, it depends on many things. So age is one of the issues to be taken into account, undoubtedly, but also the circumstances and all the child's previous experiences.
We've talked about principle throughout our conversation. We'd like to trace the circle and we want to get it right, the circle of practice. But if we don't set the point of compass in the center, it won't come out right. In the center is perhaps, I don't know if you agree, in this case of training in the pedagogy of death, which is what it's all about.
Yes, I completely agree.
Well, Elizabeth, thank you so much for answering our questions and for teaching us so much. Delighted to have you here and see you soon.
Thank you.